Hello everyone, it's Grace and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a wrap-up of my 2021 Reddit bingo card from the subreddit r/fantasy, and this bingo card runs, I believe, from April 1st until like the very end of March, and you're able to submit your cards starting in mid-March, and there's supposed to be a post about it, but to be honest, I'm not all of that concerned about like submitting my card to them. This was more of just a personal thing for me where I made my own spreadsheet for the challenge and decided to kind of just see if I could fill it out, and I was really on top of it for maybe like 5 or 6 months, and then I kind of forgot to keep updating it. I forgot to keep up with it as much as I had been doing. So I do have another video where I did sort of like a mid-year update on how I was doing with my bingo card, and I will link that in the description if you want to see how I was doing. But I decided, since it's the end of March and this time period is ending, to take a look back and see how I did even when I wasn't explicitly planning any of this, and to see if what I read managed to complete this bingo card, or at least most of it. So it turns out that even without planning, I did pretty well. Out of 25 squares, I managed to complete 22 of them. So there are only going to be 3 squares that I don't touch on, which are Gothic fantasy, a forest setting, and SFF related nonfiction. I know for a fact that I didn't read any science fiction fantasy related nonfiction, but for Gothic fantasy and the forest setting, I may have been able to find something for forest setting, but a few of the books that could have fit that I have used for other things. And in Gothic fantasy, I thought about Piranesi, but I was unsure whether that would even be Gothic fantasy, because I am unsure really about the definition of Gothic fantasy. So do with that as you will. If you think that Piranesi is Gothic, then perhaps I have filled that square as well. But let's move on to the ones that I actually know that I completed. So I will tell you what the prompt was and what the conditions on it were, and then I will tell you what I did to fill it. Oh, one thing that I will say before we begin is that even though this is the Reddit fantasy bingo card, the rules actually state that any speculative fiction is applicable for this. So it can be anything under the SFF umbrella, including horror, and that they will accept that for the card, I think, as long as you're reading mostly fantasy. So the very first one is 5 short stories, and the regular mode for this is just exactly how it sounds, but the hard mode for this is to read a complete collection of short stories. So I have been reading from the Edgar Allan Poe collection that I have of all of his works, so I have read 5 short stories from there. I don't really have their names written down because I know that I've read more than 5 short stories from there since I've read 450 pages, but I just kind of have that in there. And the other thing is that I read How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu, which is a book that is a novel, and the narrative spans through interconnected sci-fi short stories, but it's not really a short story collection. So I wasn't really sure whether to consider that I had completed this prompt on hard mode, because if you consider How High We Go in the Dark to be a collection of sci-fi short stories, then yes, I have read an entire collection. But technically it's not really that. So I will leave that up to you. You can tell me what you think. The second one is to read a fantasy book set in Asia, and hard mode is to read one by an Asian author. So for this, the one extra rule to consider is that if you were reading secondary world fantasy, it just has to be something set in an analogous Asian setting that is based on like a real life Asian setting, if that makes sense. Like, it doesn't need to be set in actual Asia. So the one that I chose for this for hard mode was The Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, because the setting that she has chosen definitely like translates to a real life Asian setting, like in her version of it. So, and Fonda Lee herself is Asian as well. So this definitely fit for that. Technically I could have chosen any of the individual books, but I decided to just say the entire Greenbone Saga because you can't repeat authors on the card anyway. So it really just the entire series is considered for that square. The third one across the top is From the A to Z Genre Guide. So in the original post and in my description, I will link this actual genre guide that they provided as a resource. And the hard mode for this was to read a book by a BIPOC author from the list. So for this, I have Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark because it is on the guide, and of course P. Djeli Clark is a Black man, so this fits for both of those, not to mention that it was a fantastic novella and I loved it. I talked about it in my Books You Can Read in a Day vlog, and I absolutely blew through it because it was fantastic. Next up we have Found Family, and the hard mode for this is that one member of the Found Family identifies as LGBTQ+. So for this I used Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames because this is definitely a found family trope in terms of all of the members of the band coming back together in order to go on an adventure. And the wizard Moog is a gay man, so that definitely counts for hard mode for this prompt. And then next up is one that I actually thought was quite difficult, but luckily enough, I read a book almost right away last April that fit this one, and that is First Person Point of View. And First Person Point of View by itself isn't that tricky, but for hard mode, it's First Person Point of View where there is more than one perspective in the book and all of them are written in first person. And I don't know if it's just me, but I find that a lot of the times there aren't as many books that have multiple points of view that are written in first person. Maybe there are a lot out there and I have just not read them, but the one that I ended up reading for this was Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahiran because our two main characters, the witch and the witch hunter, we get both of their perspectives and they're both written in first person, so this was a lifesaver for me. The next square on the card is an r/fantasy book club pick, and there is a vast list of book club picks that they provide. They have a Goodreads shelf of them, and the hard mode for this was to actually participate in discussions. So I knew automatically that I was not going to have successfully done hard mode for any of these because I didn't participate in any discussions. But regardless, the one that I ended up choosing that fit this square that I read last July was One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston, and that was a surprise to me that they had chosen it, but I thought about it and I realized that, like, yeah, this does have some like fantasy sci-fi elements along with the romance. Unfortunately, the sci-fi aspects of this one were what disappointed me, so maybe I was just like suppressing that from my brain, but indeed that was like a sci-fi romance. So yeah, that's my pick for that one. Next up, we have a new to you author, which could be a vast majority of what I read last year, but the hard mode for this was that you hadn't actually heard very much about that author before you picked up one of their works. And so because of that, I chose Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse because Black Sun was getting some hype on BookTube, but I really didn't know anything about it or Rebecca Roanhorse before I decided to pick it up. Like, I knew that people had liked it, but that's about it. And so obviously that was enough to motivate me to pick it up, but I wouldn't consider that knowing a lot of backstory about it. So that was a pretty easy one to fill as well, luckily, because I've been reading a lot of new stuff to me in the past year since I've started my channel. So next up is Gothic Fantasy, but we already talked about that one, so I am just going to skip right to Backlist Book. And so for this, there were a few conditions on it. First of all, hard mode was that you had to read a book from an author's backlist that was published before 2000, and the other wrinkle is that this had to still be an actively publishing author. So what I ended up choosing was Pet Sematary by Stephen King, because that was published in the 1980s, and Stephen King, because he is a madman and has published a billion books, is still an actively publishing author, which I'm thankful to him for, because otherwise, I don't think I would have had a book that counted for this. But Pet Sematary was my first Stephen King. I read that in October in honor of Halloween, and I really enjoyed it, so that one fits for this prompt. Next up is the revenge-seeking character, and the hard mode for this is that your protagonist has revenge as their motivation for basically the entire plot of the book. And so for this, I put in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, but I feel like it's important to focus on the latter part of the series, and I'm not going to say anything specific because I don't want to give spoilers, but yeah, they're our main character definitely wants revenge on a certain person for many things that they did, and they're infuriating, and people who have read it know, you know exactly who, and you also wanted them to go down, because Robin Hobb is great at writing characters and getting emotions out of you. So suffice it to say, there's definitely some revenge being seeked. I feel like I was looking for the word sought, but my brain just died in the middle of that sentence. Next up, we have a mystery plot, which is exactly what it sounds like, but the hard mode for this is that the book cannot be primary world urban fantasy. So the one that I chose for this was Leviathan Wakes, because while this is a sci-fi space opera, at its core, the first book in The Expanse really is a mystery. So I thought that it would fit this one really well. Next up, we have the Comfort Read square, and this was a square that did not count for a reread, so if you reread a book for this square, you were not penalized for it. However, the hard mode was to find a new comfort read, something that was not a reread. And so for this, I chose specifically The Sea of Monsters by Rick Riordan, because that is the one that I read last year, but I was thinking of just the Percy Jackson series in general, because they are fun. They're short, they're fun, they're easy, they are definitely comforting, and I've never read them before. I'm reading them for the first time as an adult, so they fit hard mode for me for this one. The next square is published in 2021, and the hard mode for this was that it had to be an author's debut. So unfortunately, I did not read a book that fit this. The Love Hypothesis would have been the closest thing, but that is not science fiction, fantasy, or horror, so unfortunately, no hard mode for me on this one, but I decided to go with The Fall of Babel why did I say it like that? The Fall of Babel by Josiah Bancroft for this, because that was published in November, and that was the conclusion to the Books of Babel, and that fits. It was published in 2021, so that unfortunately doesn't fit hard mode, but it is what it is. Next up, we have Cat Squasher, which is a book of 500 plus pages, and the hard mode for this was Lion Squasher, which is a book of 800 plus pages. So for this, I chose The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan, because depending on what edition you look at, it comes in somewhere between the mid 900s to above 1,000 in the mass market, but regardless, it is definitely more than 800 pages without a doubt, and I read that in April, I believe. It's been a while now, but The Shadow Rising is still absolutely one of my favorites from the Wheel of Time, and it was a big boy. So a lion could get a big smack out of that. Next up is SFF-related nonfiction, but again, I already mentioned that I didn't complete that one, so we'll move on to a Latin American or a Latinx author. And for this one, I have Each of Us a Desert by Mark Oshiro, and they are a non-binary Latinx author, self-identified as such. Each of Us a Desert was a fantastic book, and I really enjoyed it, so I am hoping to read more of their works in the future. I believe that they have one other book published, so I will definitely have to have a look at that. And the other hard mode for this was that the book has less than 1,000 ratings on Goodreads, and so currently this book has like 1,020 ratings, but at the time that I read it, it did have less than 1,000 ratings. So I'm counting it. I'm pretty sure that that counts because at the time that I read it, it did fit. So I think that that counts. Next up, we have self-published, and for this, the hard mode is to have less than 50 Goodreads ratings. And if I'm being honest with myself, I am not scouring that in depth that I am finding out about things as one of the very first 50 people to ever read it. I feel like that doesn't usually happen. Maybe I will get there because I am starting to follow more self-published authors on Twitter, and I really like to kind of try and follow them and see what's coming out so that I can start to read more self-pub. But to this point, I don't feel like I've been in the very, very, very first people to hear about a book. But regardless, the one that I did choose for this is The Sword of Kaigen because it is self-published. It is just a little bit more popular, which is great. It's awesome for The Sword of Kaigen, but again, it doesn't fit hard mode, which is okay. Next up is the forest setting, which again, I did not complete, or if I did, a book for it is slipping my mind at the moment. So we're gonna move on to genre mashup. And the hard mode for this is that the book actually mashes up 3 or more genres instead of 2 or more genres. So the one that I chose for this is actually Feet of Clay by Terry Pratchett, which is the 3rd book in the City Watch series of Discworld, because I feel like this is a fantasy comedy murder mystery romance. I feel like it has strong elements of a whole bunch of things, and this was a really strong book, so it managed to bring all of that together super well, and I loved it. But I really do feel like it's got at least 3 or 4 genres that are playing a part here, and I don't know if comedy and absurdism is considered its own genre or if that's just like a subtype, but even if it's not, I do feel like it has an element of romance where 2 of your characters are forming a stronger relationship and you follow their actual relationship. So honestly, I think it works. Next up, we have the chapter titles square, and the hard mode for this is that every single chapter has chapter titles that are more than 1 word. So not just someone's name and not just a number, but actually a title. And so for this, I used Fireborn by Rosaria Munda, so this fits hard mode. I was pleasantly surprised when I checked to see that every chapter title is actually a descriptive title, so thank you, Fireborn, for fitting in that because I was not sure what I was going to use for that one. Next up, and one of my personal favorite squares, just because I find it funny, is the title blank of blank, and the hard mode for this is blank of blank and blank, which I just find funny because it seems like so many titles now follow that template, but it's surprisingly hard to find one in my list. So what I ended up going with was The Empress of Salt and Fortune to fit hard mode, and of course I could just read some other YA book. I'm sure there's an entire lineup of ones that have the blank of blank and blank, but The Empress of Salt and Fortune was a fantastic little novella, and I'm very glad that I read that one. So next up, the original square on the card for this spot was a first contact story, but that's not really my style. That's not really the type of story that I'm particularly interested in. So I decided to exercise the option to replace 1 square on your card with any square from a previous Reddit Fantasy bingo card. And the one that I went with is one from the 2020 card, which was a snow, ice, or cold setting. And the hard mode for this is that the entire book takes place in that setting. And this ended up being a very easy choice because I put The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden in here, and the entire Winternight trilogy can sort of fit in this, but The Bear and the Nightingale especially really has that cold winter forest setting. So again, with the forest setting, I just chose to put this book here. But this is like a really atmospheric book, so it just fits perfectly in this cold setting one. The next square was a trans or non-binary character, and the hard mode for this was that your trans or non-binary character is a main character. And so for this, I was able to use Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, and this was a really fun story. I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed the main character as well. Next up is a debut author, and the hard mode for this is that this author has done a Reddit Fantasy AMA. And so this one is actually a little bit funny because the author that I chose was Joe Abercrombie and the book that I chose was The Blade itself. Because this square says nothing about any sort of timeline. It just means that the book you read has to be an author's debut. Whenever that was, which was like in the mid-2000s, I think, but The Blade itself was Joe Abercrombie's debut, and I had not read anything from him yet. So this one counts, and it counts for hard mode because Joe Abercrombie has done an AMA for Reddit Fantasy. So even though this is like a solid 15-year-old book, maybe even longer than that, I'm not sure, it was still his debut, so it works. And then finally, the square in the bottom corner of the card is witches. And the hard mode for this is that your main protagonist is a witch. So I read a few witch books this past year, but the other ones like Serpent and Dove and like the Winternight trilogy, they have been used in other spots on this card. So what I ended up going with for this was Alatsue by Darcy Littlebadger, because our main character has this skill to raise ghosts that has been passed down from her traditionally through her Lipan Apache family, and I hope I said that right, I'm not sure. But the rules for this basically just state that if witchcraft or magic is being done in a way that would be considered magic, like in the culture that you're dealing with or in the tradition that you're dealing with, then it counts. I'm fairly confident that it counts, even if she's not explicitly considered as a witch. There is definitely magic going on in this book. So that is it. That was my 25 bingo squares and the 22 that I successfully completed. So I feel pretty good about that. And hopefully if I take a look at the 2022 bingo card, which should be coming out in the next week or so, hopefully I'll be interested in it again, because I think that this is a really fun thing, kind of just to push you to like maybe read other things that you wouldn't have originally been planning on, or kind of like pushing your boundaries. So I think that it's really nice in that sense to try and do things like that, and I had fun even though it was sometimes hard to figure out what was going to fit where. I had fun planning this out, and I had fun kind of rounding it up and seeing how I did, and I'm happy with how I did. So if you also did Reddit bingo cards, please let me know how you did. Let me know what you think about my choices, my selections, and I really hope that you liked this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Like if you liked it, subscribe if you would like to see more content from me. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday, and I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye!